The story of King Arthur, the legend famous for assimilating every myth the British could take over. From Celtic mythology to the more recent Charlemagne legends, with all the stories the King Arthur legend has assimilated, you may be surprised to find that there is a mythology right on the English doorstep that barely got touched by it. Of course, I am referring to the Welsh mythology. According to the book Bullfinch's Mythology, the Welsh refused to translate their mythology from Welsh to English. So, unlike poor Tristan and Isolde of Irish descent, the tales of Welsh mythology went relatively untouched. However, myths and legends gain their strength and popularity through retellings. Thus, there's an almost universal cultural understanding of Excalibur, and an almost universal shrug when it comes to the understanding of the Castle of Llyr. In 1964, a man by the name of Lloyd Alexander finally decided to tell the world about the Welsh mythology in a book series aimed at children. And while I'm not the authority on how well he managed to do it, I do want to explore this book series and explore the idea of adapting a mythology rarely heard.
Audio, take 14.
What?
Munching on your hand.
It's the most efficient way for me to scratch my hand, okay?
Yeah, okay. That's staying in.
I know. This is the Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. You may not know this, but it's possible that you have some familiarity with the series, as Disney made a movie about both the first and second book, named after the second book. It's confusing. It's called The Black Cauldron. You know, the Disney movie that Disney is less comfortable talking about than Song of the South, the Disney movie that implied that slavery wasn't so bad. This is not just because the movie is terrible. And I know Breadsword made a video saying it's actually not, but that movie is among the worst adaptations I've ever seen. And I saw both Percy Jackson films. Even if we don't look at it as an adaptation, it still fails tremendously in almost every regard except animation. But the main reason they don't like to talk about it is that it almost killed Disney. One day. Anyways, when I say you might have some familiarity with the book's plot, I mean that in the loosest of senses possible. With that out of the way, let's just begin the review. The Book of Three is about Taran, an assistant pig keeper who wants to become a hero. One day he discovers that the pig he is guarding is psychic and holds a secret to keep the kingdom of Prydain safe. Ironically, after it vanishes, Taran sets off to save the pig and finally gets a chance to become the hero he always wanted to be, to his own dismay. This book is what I'd mostly describe as setup for other books, and while almost all serialized fantasy is this to one extent or another, the Book of Three feels the most abrasively like that. The first 5 chapters feels like the biggest lore dump that has ever been before the plot can actually get a move on, and I know that some things actually happen in those chapters, but it's so slow because of that pacing caused by all this lore being just dumped on you, just to make you understand the world. Now I realize that you have to get the lore in somehow to make people not be completely devoid of the world. But I find the best way to do this is to make you care about the characters and therefore care about their lives and therefore care about how this world is different, so that you can be invested in that world as well. The biggest problem with the book, though, is the author's inability to allow himself to put the characters in any real danger. I find that almost always there is a Deus Ex Machina ready to just pop out and save them, and that's never really as interesting as seeing a character use their wits or their abilities to get out of situations. Now, if you ask 21-year-old me, I would have probably said, oh, this book should have been called The Book of Unearned Victories instead of The Book of Three. But I've seen Dragon Quest. Now, there's not a single thing there that actually feels earned. Except that one! And while these issues are a big deal for me, there's also several strengths in this book. And all of them are the characters, which are honestly amazing, especially considering that this was written in the 60s. While I think Taran goes from a war-praising child who desperately wants to grow up to be a careful, mature character a bit too quickly, I think all the characters here are good. I have mentioned Taran, but you also got characters like... Wait, how are you supposed to spell this? Oh my god, there's a pronunciation guide in the back of the book. Any high fantasy authors listening out there, have this in your book. This saved me a lot of headaches. Because turns out, Princess Eowyn, that was easy mode anyways. I have mentioned Taran, but there's also Princess Eowyn, who is an amazingly competent and reckless female character who is far more progressive than some characters written today. And just in case you forgot, this was published in 1964. Gögi is also an amazingly loyal character that grows on you, and not just because the book says he does, unlike the movie. Sorry, keep reminding you of the movie. If you saw it, I'm so sorry. Just don't watch it. Fleur de Flamme is an amazingly awesome bardic prince who feels he still has to spice up his stories despite his stories being rather impressive. To give you an image of this guy, he would basically run into an enemy army, slaughter 50 men, and then decide to spice things up later. But my favorite character is Dolly. Dolly is an angry dwarf who is sick of you before he sees you.
Ah! Fly into my fist!
I can relate. Not to remind you too much of the Disney movie, I'm really trying to avoid that, but I feel there's one thing they did better than the book. That's the design of the Horned King and his presence. He oozes control, dangers, and evil in the movie and in the book. Okay, you can see it. He doesn't do that in the book. In this story, Taran goes on an adventure with Princess Eowyn, Gögi, Fleur de Flamme, henceforth known as the Gang, and various kings of Prydain to retrieve the Black Cauldron, which can resurrect people and make them unkillable soldiers for the enemy. Naturally, they set out to destroy it. First off, this is an amazing concept. I love how Taran's accomplishments in the last book translates to him earning a place among the royals of Prydain when they go on the quest for the Black Cauldron. Secondly, having the enemies always be stronger than your main protagonist is a great way of actually making the entire situation seem more threatening, especially when they become brain-dead, unkillable soldiers with only murder in mind. And it just adds this kind of zombie-like dread that you often get in narratives, but it never really focuses on killing zombies. It focuses more on avoiding immortal zombies coming into the world. But what this book does best is that it makes Deus Ex Machina work. While in the last book, solutions came a bit too easy, in this book every one of these solutions have a terrible price. I'm gonna spoil something minor, so skip to this time zone if you don't want to hear it. Right, when they finally get the Black Cauldron, it turns out that someone has to sacrifice themselves to destroy it. There's no way for me to really explain how wonderfully dark the atmosphere gets once the entire gang has to discuss which one of us has the least to live for and should sacrifice themselves to the Black Cauldron. It's just great. I love seeing situations that dire in books. Especially when they're aimed at children. They should learn to fear mortality. This book also introduces Eldir. I swear you can touch the Welsh in these names sometimes, who is a great character because he reflects Taran so well. And by that I mean I hate him so much. This character is basically a reflection of Taran's want for fame and glory. But whereas Taran actually grew up in the last book, albeit very suddenly, this character has had no such growth. He serves as a great reminder of how terrible Taran would have been if he hadn't had that growth in the first book. Now, this character does have redemption towards the end, which makes me forgive him more, but I still get physically angry when I think about that douchebag. And when you evoke an emotional response in me, that's really impressive. It ties neatly into the meta-narrative as well, which is that it's far more important to do a job than be praised for it. While this theme has been thoroughly written about, Lloyd Alexander found an amazingly interesting angle through his characters to blow new life into this theme. I also briefly want to mention the 3 witches in the marshes of Morva, which are great. They are kind of a reflection of the 3 Norns from Greek mythology and, well, also from Norse mythology. It's fun how myths sometimes overlap. But they are 3 witches that switches personality, not body, instead of one eye that can see everything, and are able to do basically anything. And I think it's great to have such a force that is way stronger than the main character could ever be. They could probably just wipe out everything in a snap, like I demonstrated just now. But they don't want to, they don't feel like it. I think it's great to have this Lovecraftian fear just suddenly be part of the story, just because it reminds you, no matter how strong the main character gets, he can get squished. You can probably surmise that I thought this book was great. If I have one problem with it, it's that it still uses Deus Ex Machina, and even though I say it does this right, or at least in a correct manner, I still have a personal preference for books that just have people come over obstacles using their inherent skills. But this was still a great read. It's safe to say that the Black Cauldron was an improvement from the Book of 3 in virtually every aspect, with deeper character moments, a better story and plot, and it introduced forces mightier than the main character could ever be. The Black Cauldron set a high standard. Did the Castle of Llyr meet this standard? No, it didn't. The story is about Eowyn going back to the island her kingdom was located on to marry Prince Rune. Huh, you can even read this one. Then she gets kidnapped and Taran has to join forces with Prince Rune and the gang to save her. So this story is problematic right from the start, turning Eowyn into such a damsel in distress when she has been such an archetype of feminist thought throughout this book, accidentally as it might be. Especially when she doesn't know much about her origin. Like, it would have been much better to have her be part of the story, rather than having her be set to the sideline just to be a plot device rather than a character. If you're so desperate for kidnapping, take Prince Rune instead. He's been established as worsted in every regard, and have the villainess try to lure Eowyn to her instead, because she couldn't kidnap her. She's too smart, too stubborn, and we learned in book 1 that she has a knack for getting out of situations, so it would only make sense. You can even have your stupid love plot start between Taran and Princess Eowyn because he has to reluctantly help her and start to develop feelings for her. Which, yeah, I don't feel this is a spoiler. This is the book that actually introduces a love plot between Taran and Princess Eowyn, which was bound to happen. Male protagonist and female supporting character in a children's book from 1960s kind of makes it a given that they'll end up together. Come on. While I have next to no experience with romance, I mean, look at me. I do know how to build up romance in a story, and trust me when I say that Lloyd Alexander is not the master of wooing through words. Alexander Lloyd's writing on relationships seems as forced as all my jokes. The plot is also riddled with coincidence with no sacrifice, well except at the end, but I'll get into that later. I literally praise the Black Cauldron for finding a way to make the concept of Deus Ex Machina actually interesting. But then it retires back to the comforts found in the Book of 3. The notable difference, which I am eternally grateful for, is that there isn't a multi-chapter lore dump in it. I also like that the main villain isn't the main antagonist throughout the series, which has barely been developed now that I think about it. It's great because we already have a relationship with this villain and know what she's capable of, but also we get introduced to new sides of her powers, which is really fun. And also, Fleur de Flamme rides a giant cat into battle. I just feel I should mention that. That's great. That's like one of the best parts of this entire book. I try to keep my reviews spoiler free, so they're more accessible to people. Yeah, see how that's gone in the past, even in this review. But I feel I have to talk about this. So if you are interested, here is a time code to the next book in the series. Just whenever you're ready. Or if you just don't care, I mean, I'm not the boss of you. Right, now let's talk about the one time that coincidence is related to sacrifice, like in the Black Cauldron. Near the end of the book, Princess Eowyn has to decide between saving her friends and lose her potential to become a sorceress, or help Archon. What's with these names being pronounceable all of a sudden? I'm sorry. And get her powers, like the rest of the women in her family. Naturally, because it's a children's book, she gives up her powers to save her friends. But I think it's a real shame, because if the book had been about her journey, discovering more about her family's history, and discovering more and more of her powers, and choosing to give up that to save someone she barely knows, that would have been far more noble and shown her more rare and thoughtful side, rather than her more childlike side. I don't think the one who should have to make a sacrifice is the one who got degraded to a plot point. And besides, it would have given her a really good reason not to be part of the next book, because she would study magic with Dalbin and be even more useful. While I'm glad she remains defiant and useful throughout the rest of the books, it doesn't make up for the fact that she had to sacrifice her powers. The story picks up where we left off. Taran head over underwritten heels for Princess Eowyn, but he finds out that he can't marry her because he's not royalty. So he goes on a quest with Gurgi to find out who his father is with the help of the witches of the Marsh of Morva. After being unable to pay the price for the truth, he sets out to find out who his family is. So despite this being a really dumb plan, I kinda like the story. It offers us an easy way to get to know Taran, Prydain, and its people without it seeming forced like in book 1. Besides, Taran's family has always been in the background and never really explored, so it could be interesting to see how he deals with potential bloodlines and the social status that would acquire him in a more medieval setting. I also find that the plot and its resolutions are far better as Taran finally gets out of this swamp of coincidences and into I have to start doing things for myself. And sure, there are some coincidences, but they're far fewer. Now, if only the few coincidences he encountered actually had horrible consequences, that would have been great. But sadly, you can't have it all, it seems. The book also introduces a lot of side stories with smaller people that turn out way bigger in the larger scheme of the entire story, which I think is really fun, but at the same time it kind of makes the world seem a little bit too connected to Taran. Another thing that I'm really fond of for this book is that it deals with the theme of finding out what you really want to do with your life and turning out to not be good at it whatsoever. I think it's important for children's books to talk more about that you might not be able to do what you want and therefore have to settle for something less so they don't get as disappointed when they grow up, to maybe have an injury that makes them unable to play in a certain sport professionally that they want to, or get dyscalculia so they can't be a rocket scientist like I wanted to become. I lie, I actually wanted to become a mad scientist when I was young. It's like in the cards. I feel that the point is kinda dulled by him being a great smith and weaver, but as this is a book based on mythology and oral tradition, I get that the rule of 3 is to make it seem more like one of those stories. And as a fan of mythology, I really appreciate that. There are 2 issues I have with this book. The first one is that it introduces an amazing villain that has a connection to a certain character in the gang. And he almost immediately gets dispatched, and he has great build-up and is genuinely threatening and actually kinda scary. And he's just killed. He would have been amazing to have in the last book for that character to confront. My second problem is a bit spoilery, so I'll try to keep it vague because I've already messed up my point of trying to make it as spoiler-free as possible to make it more accessible for everyone. But there is a chance for a killing blow to hit Taran, and someone pushes him out of the way. And instead of killing that character lives. Now I think it would have been much better if that character died, because that would actually introduce the threat of mortality for people on the good side who have usually been immune to everything, wearing the thickest of plot armors. I think that would have been better than just suddenly striking you over the head with, nope, it's book 5 now, last book, people are gonna die. Speaking of which, as the only sword that can defeat the ultimate evil in the world is stolen, the final battle has come, where all the kings and heroes gather to take out the main villain of the story named Taran will travel with them and the gang in hopes of pushing away the evil that spreads across Prydain. Evil that was first clearly established in Taran Wanderer. Okay, a couple of things come off as problematic from the start. Firstly, the tainting of Prydain should have been hinted at earlier than the last book. Maybe when they got back from the boat of when they came back from Llyr, or even the Black Cauldron, or even Book of 3, but not the second to last book where it's, oh, suddenly, yeah, there's a evil taint that spreads across Prydain. We should probably do something about that. Secondly, the big villain of the piece has hardly been developed. Now, villains in the background can work, just look at the Emperor from Star Wars. Now imagine if they mentioned him briefly 5 scenes before the throne room scene, and then he just showed up. You'd probably think, who is this guy? Why should I care? That's basically the big bad of this book, Emperor Palpatine, but without any build-up. And there are attempts at build-up, but to call them laughable would be an insult to things that actually are laughable. And third, the book should perhaps set up the final battle earlier in the series rather than just, oh, they stole the magical sword that can kill the big bad. Now we gotta fight him. It would have been so much better if they just carefully built it up. But no, there's the reason we gotta do the plots. But where it fails in its story bits, I feel that it more than makes up for in the plot. We get reunited with every character that has lived through the books, which, while it might be unrealistic, I still think is great cheesy fun. This also gives off the impression that the entire book series has been planned. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna read directly off the script because when I wrote this down I felt so smart until I found out that I'd gone outside without pants. It doesn't make up for the less than great books, but it makes me feel less like I didn't waste my time reading the lesser parts of the story. That's good, right? There's also a lot of feats over coincidence in this story. Again, there's some lingering, like in Taran Wanderer, but it's still a vast improvement. The only thing that I really have a big problem with is the prophecy, which seems a bit, hammed in. Because the oracle is a pig. And the pig tells the prophecy because it's the oracle. Just forced as all my jokes. I'm so funny, right?
I get it.
Thank you. This prophecy feels so anticlimactic to me, I suspect, because he always manages to solve it just in time, just when it becomes relevant. Which, yeah, it's more narratively satisfying that way, but it's just so clumsily done. There's also the small matter that this book just glances over battles. Usually in these books, every battle has been vital because they can die at any time, and now it's just hand-waved. And I get why there's far more battles here, and you can't just have your characters in mortal peril all the time. Oh my god, are they gonna live? But it still feels less like Chronicles of Prydain when battles become something you can just look away from. This bothers me far more than it should, which is the tagline for my entire series, basically. Something that I find needs special mention is the final battle, which is hysterically anticlimactic. The great villain challenges Taran and is almost immediately killed. Other villains in this series have had better build-up, fights, and deaths. Lloyd, I know you can do better. You literally did better in the same series than the last book, goddammit. I like the ending though. Not the final battle, that was stupid. But I do like how the story wraps up with a neat little bow with Taran's final decision. Really ties the whole story together real nicely. Now, the only part that could have made that better was if Lloyd Alexander could actually write romance, but you can't win them all. Apparently. So, time to move to the conclusion. Fine. The Founding and Other Tales of Prydain is an anthology of short stories set in the Prydain universe. Thing is, I don't really like anthologies, but I like the world that he built, not to mention characters, and the mythological inspirations were great. Besides, I've gotten this far in the book, so I figured I'd give it a shot. There isn't a lot to be said here. The stories are basically either... There's some good stories here, like the stone and the sword. Those are pretty good, but for the most part it's just stories that were either hinted at or were in by-sentences being expanded upon, and the only conclusion I can reach is that these stories were better as by-sentences and things that were just hinted at. But there is a nice sentiment here where the author actually writes that, "Thank you, people, for telling me to write more. This is for you." Actually, now that I think about it, that might have been a threat. Force me to write more, and I swear I will. Now we can go to the conclusion. How do you conclude reviewing an entire series when each installment was so massively different in quality? I think the best I can do is invoke the words I've already used when I talk about Book 5. It doesn't make up for the lesser than great books, but it makes me feel like I didn't waste my time reading the lesser parts of the story. The Chronicles of Prydain was overall a very fun read that I can truly recommend to fans of fantasy, people who want to get into Welsh mythology, and parents who want something that they can be engaged in as well. with their kids when they read to them. Granted, the child has to deal with some more adult themes than are usual in children's literature, but I think that's a point to its advantage. Personally, I found it to be a surprisingly progressive book, to be one written in the 60s with still some problematic overtones and a little bit of problems here and there, but overall I really enjoyed it. Once upon a time, I indirectly said on this channel that nobody cares about Wales. And I think I thought that because it seems so similar to England that there's virtually no difference. I suppose that the best tactic for living next to a behemoth of a void sucking in all other cultures is to pretend to already be assimilated. While you shouldn't force your society to change backwards to actually accept the language that is dying in the culture, you should document it further so that it can prevail. The British won't steal any more of your culture right now to assimilate into their own. Lloyd Alexander seems to have understood this. If you don't start documenting your own stories and your own language, you'll end up becoming just like England, and you'll be fully assimilated. And they will be able to grab your stories and your language, not for them to use, but to discard. The English have ruined cultures around the world and or claim them as their own. Don't let what seemed like the Welsh culture fighting back for over 1,000 years turn out to be a slow death. So document your language, tell your stories, and show those idiots who decided that not having a dragon on the Union Jack was a good idea, that you're a different culture, not just a vacuum of theft like them. So, after watching this video a million times, because I'm real proud of it, I realized two things. I should really like my videos, and kinda mess up the point I want to get across. Look, what I wanted to say was that England has ruined things so much through imperialism. And I tried to use Wales to focus on that through these books, and I didn't stop myself from saying way too much. I just focused too much on Wales, so the point became muddled and it became almost a recruitment video for nationalism, which I never want to do. Nationalism is awful and leads to discrimination and terrible, terrible things. Nationalism has never led to anything good. Ever. But while I have the camera here, I can just make another point that I actually wanted to make, which is that we should have a wider understanding of different mythologies and cultures, so we have more to put in our universal canon of understanding. So we have more sources and things to derive from. And secondly, we should take care of the Walisian language, not because of any nationalism, and we shouldn't force people to learn it, but we should have it documented just because it's so weird. I mean, look at this. You would not guess that that's pronounced Glyndor, would you? Like,
It's pronounced Gryffindor. I hit my foot.
Hi everyone, thought I'd stop by while the credits are rolling and just thank you for watching me ramble on and on about the Chronicles of Prydain, a book series that I feel needs a little bit more love. For about how much recording time do we have just on the audio?
We have 50 minutes of footage.
And that's not even counting the things in between. That's like almost an hour. Hopefully it'll be shorter than that. Anyways, I thought I'd also use this to have an announcement. All the goth music that I use in the background for my videos are now up on my good friend Andreas' SoundCloud because he has made all the music. And originally I didn't actually want it up there because I wanted it to be something special to my reviews, but then I figured, nah, the goth kids need more fun.
Start boogieing, you goth nerds.
Thank you so much for watching this long stupid video, and goodbye.